He's only famous because Donald Trump likes him. And Donald Trump only likes him because he happens to be a black preacher who is willing to throw his support behind Donald Trump. And, you know, and I've said many occasions, the fastest way to notoriety and economic success, I'm not sure how much economic success this is translated into for Mark Burns, but definitely has translated into notoriety, a national platform, a national voice. The fastest way to get that is to be a black face who's willing to say the things that white people, particularly white conservatives, would never be able to get away with saying. Right. That being said, that's the individual that I'm referring to, Mark Burns. On Twitter, this is what he said yesterday, and I think it's a good jump-off point for one last conversation. He said, quote, "Racism isn't really about color." This is a black man speaking, a black preacher. "Racism has always been about the haves versus the have-nots, and President Donald Trump is raising the have-nots to the same level as the haves. In today's society, a poor white person gets treated the same as a poor black person." Now, on the surface of it, it seems plausible if you are immersed in a class critique that includes an analysis of racism, just a little, you know, it just surface value. You read it and be like, class and race. But then you read it twice, you'll be like, oh, this is not about class and race at all. This is about trying to neuter the argument that racism exists in the United States. And what better way to do that than to have a blackface to do the bidding of it? And then, of course, the line in there about, quote, "and President Donald Trump is raising the have-nots to the same level as the haves." It is extremely ridiculous to make that conclusion when you consider the real implications of the tax reform bill, which is literally putting billions, I mean 1.5 trillion to be exact, into the hands of corporations and the richest people in America at the expense of programs that help the have-nots. So how can you help the have-nots when you're taking the money, literally taking money from the have-nots and giving it to the haves? So the absurdity and the ludicrousness of that, I had to pause and think, of that particular sentence really just undermines anything substantive that you could pull out of this tweet. And I'm trying to deal fairly with this tweet and not just call it rubbish, but actually let's consider what he's saying here and see what's good and what's not good. In today's society, this is the last part of the tweet. In today's society, a poor white person gets treated the same as a poor black person, end quote. No, that's not true. In today's society, poor white people have a hard time. I would say in today's society, economically, clearly, a white person has a harder time economically than a middle-class, rich white person. And included in that are some systemic injustices. Yes, but to be sure, a poor white person, I believe, and I don't want to take credit for it, so I'm going to go to his timeline. Samuel, I cannot remember his last name, but he's giving some quick facts about the reality that poor white people actually can live in a middle-class black life experience. And if you keep going up, it's like a middle-class white American are able to afford and are given opportunities to live like a wealthy black person. So there's clear evidence to suggest that this idea that there's some type of equality because of poverty is quickly undermined by the actual data, right? The spirit of it is something that we talk about on this. No. Actually, I have to correct myself. Not the spirit of it, but what a person like me would read initially would say that there is something to the idea of class solidarity that we need to expand on a whole lot more. But I've been around the block long enough to understand that this tweet is utter garbage, right? Number one. And number two, that this tweet is very intentional in trying to undermine the cause of anti-racism, the cause of the civil rights, the cause of Black Lives Matter, the cause of actual equality. This tweet is uniquely designed to undermine that. And number three, it's really just something to service the person who's making Mark Burns famous, which is Donald Trump, which is to draw this extremely fallacious conclusion that Donald Trump is doing something that is bringing up the have-nots to the haves. It's almost so absurd that we shouldn't even talk about it. However, this guy's platform and the size that it's grown to because of Donald Trump actually warrants us to have this conversation, because how many people are going to believe this lie? The 3 lies in one tweet. How many people are going to actually say, that's right? I mean, of course, you know, the more skeptical in my audience would say only idiots would believe it. And I would say then how many idiots are in America? Enough to elect Donald Trump. But I digress. Samuel Sinyangwe, I'm sure I brutalized that last name. This is what he said. Poor white families have 150 times more wealth than poor black families. And whites who have never been to college have more wealth than blacks with a college degree. Racism is about race. I mean, you can't look at those numbers and actually come to the conclusion of anything else. That even at the core, even inside a class analysis, there is race. There is a race component that cannot be denied. And the problem I think I have, and I'm not here to punch left, I'm actually here to punch right over at Mark Burns and conservatives who are forwarding this lie. But the only problem I have with leftists would be they feel as though class analysis is the apex of analyses, and that nothing else transcends a class analysis. And that's wrong. That's wrong in a material sense, and that's wrong in a practical, modern day sense. Historically, it's wrong as well. It's equal. You absolutely cannot neglect the racial component, particularly in the United States, in this late stage of capitalism. You cannot neglect the role of racism any more than you can neglect the role of classism. And it seems like an argument that we have to have over and over and over again, because the jury apparently is still out for so many people. So many people where you have a grouping of people who would like nothing more than this to be about class. This is not where Mark Burns falls into. Mark Burns and his sycophant love for Donald Trump, he's doing this as a service to empire, to a service to Donald Trump. I won't even give him the credit of saying that this is to the service of capitalism. This is nothing more than his fanboy love affair for Donald Trump, period. But on the opposite side of the equation is the conversation that is ongoing in leftist circles, where some people feel like the apex of any type of analysis is the class analysis, to the neglect, to the detriment of a racial analysis. Just like you have people who say race is everything, and they say race is everything as an intentional tool to ignore a class analysis. And both of those extremes are extremely wrong. The reality of it is it's interwoven, it's interconnected. There's a nuanced connection and relationship between racism and classism in the United States of America. You cannot talk about class without discussing race as it pertains to class. And you can't talk about race without talking about how class pertains to it. In other words, you can't talk about blackness without talking about the varying degrees of blackness in terms of economic wealth and economic opportunity, income, as well as generational wealth that's passed down in black communities, which leaves a certain class of black people in a far more privileged situation than the lower class of black people. You can't talk about race without talking about class. But likewise, you can't talk about class generally and say everything in America boils down to late stage capitalism, and race is just a useful tool to distract us. You can't talk about it in that regards, because the data actually bears this out, that at the core of the economic disparity in the United States, it is concentrated disproportionately in black communities, and that is because of years of systemic injustices and economic exploitation at the hands of capitalism, which is why you can't leave out class. But here we go again, another year and another group of people. I'm not talking about Mark Burns at this point. I'm talking about people on the left who, from the neoliberal center to the left, who want to make the conversation be about what they're comfortable talking about and what works for them economically, because we're all monsters in this capitalistic system. The reality of it is that the reason they want to only talk about class in one category is because that's what pays their bills. And the reason they only want to talk about race only in another category is because that's what pays their bills as well. And we're just here in the middle of those two extremes saying it's both and.